Thank you very much. Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. And I am at a much more junior stage in thinking about all of this. So I'm going to focus on a specific example of kind of what a collaboration that I've been working on with two colleagues and friends that draws on a protest that happened in Kenya, well, several protests that happened in Kenya early last year. And I'm going to try and also kind of reflect on some of the thinking that I've had around the scope for development humanities, the kind of benefits I see in it, and also some reflections on sort of kind of area focused, I guess, learnings, recognizing that people have long tried to engage with the arts in various different ways, even if it's not been at a grand scale. I'm Charlotte Brown. I'm just finishing up at the LSE. I'm also teaching at King's at the minute in London. The title today is Poetry and Protest in Kakuma Refugee Camp, Restoring Development Through the Humanities. So building on kind of David's thoughts and just reflecting a little bit more on my, I guess, disparate reading list that I've been engaging with. So one of the things that has really struck me is how much the kind of ideas that David is kind of putting forward resonate across different disciplines. So thinking about social policy, sociology, and other spaces of thinking about, well, really, how do we listen? Sort of there's this question of who do we listen to, but also whose voices and which forms of knowledge do we take seriously? And thinking about how do we deal with this kind of unruly space that is development and allowing more scope to listen to diverse voices and sort of modes of presentation, I guess. So some of the things I've referenced here, just so Dylan Robinson, Hungry Listening, it comes from Indigenous sound studies, thinking about Tesley's work in wild policy in Indigenous studies in Australia, and then also sociologists like Les Back, who think about what sociologists learn from music. So thinking about how do we engage with diverse presentations of knowledge, and kind of bringing those into the center to allow different forms of development to emerge. So thinking beyond kind of standard development frameworks. And so to me, I see a big resonance in this space with thinking about, if we allow scope for these other forms of knowledge, what kind of ideas come to the fore? But also this, this conversation, the very important conversation about sort of justice and the violence that comes from kind of conventional modes of development knowledge production. So in my own space, working or thinking about refugee spaces and displacement spaces, there's this consistent pushback against sort of extractive knowledge production. Participants in research say, no one ever came back, no one ever told us what happened from the study. People don't see themselves in the studies that are being produced. And so to me, there's a convergence in these kind of two trends, right? It's one about, how do we know better and understand better and think better, but also how do we not do harm in the process of knowledge production. So thinking with those kinds of ideas, my own research focuses on people's lived experiences of displacement in East Africa, mainly in northern Uganda, but more recently thinking with collaborators in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. My own work thinks about the kind of interplay between institutional policies, logics, and frameworks with a kind of historical kind of perspective, trying to do some of the things that David has suggested around working with colonial archives and oral histories and with poetry. So as I mentioned, some of these ideas are not new. Just again, in a sort of from an East African perspective, people have been kind of doing this work and trying to bring these different forms of knowledge to the fore in academic spaces. So I just wanted to highlight some of the work that I'm personally aware of, and I'm sure I'm missing a whole load of important references here. But thinking about, so for example, Naomi Pendle and her collaborator Okoye have worked on music and the politics of famine, and how music in South Sudan is a space of political discontent and expression, in ways that would otherwise maybe be completely repressed and hidden from view. So Cormac has also worked on the poetics of history to kind of bring a kind of longer view on development into perspective, drawing on voices that are, formerly marginalized. And throughout, different anthropological resources and kind of these development work that thinks with big ideas of development in these spaces, you find throughout all of these books sort of brief references, brief mentions of poets and, links to, oh, this person really helped me rethink my work or see something differently that I hadn't thought about before. And so the thing I find really encouraging about this kind of space is it has the potential to really bring those voices to the fore. So poets that have been sort of referenced in, a sidelined kind of way, or, somewhat drawn into this space, can really be allowed to stand sort of on their own as legitimate sources of knowledge. So with that in mind, as I was working on the conclusion of my PhD thesis, focusing on Uganda, these protests were occurring in Kenya in response to the aid cuts, in response to the restructuring of humanitarian aid, which sought to prioritize different refugee households across Eastern Africa and other places on the basis of need, as assessed by sort of social, household level surveys of income and all of these kind of standardized things that I'm sure many of us are familiar with. And so as I'm writing my conclusion and thinking about all these things in relation to Uganda, which is consistently referenced as a space of, formative site for refugee policy, thinking very sort of in liberal modes of the idea of, giving people jobs, allowing them space to, have their own land and all of these things, and set up as a contrast to Kenya. Peter Kiddy published these. He's a South Sudanese poet who lives in Kenya, and he published these poems on Kenya. And it felt to me as though my entire PhD had just been summarized in these really moving and really heartbreaking poems. And I guess this collaboration emerged entirely in response to what he wrote. So Peter has lived and was born, raised, and grew up in Kakuma. He is in his mid-20s, and he published these poems on Facebook. He was responding directly to this protest movement where, women of all ages marched from, their homes in Kakuma to the kind of UN compound space peacefully. They were singing songs, banging pots and pans, that sort of thing. And sadly, over the course of days, essentially, various forces grew very unhappy at their presence and opened fire on the group with some scuffles in between. And so this collaboration was an attempt to kind of capture that story in ways that were not being produced in journalist, reports. Sort of formative academic writing had not sort of captured the essence of what was going on here. So I was just reached out to Peter and asked him if he would mind if I, quoted him in my conclusion, and this collaboration grew out of that. So the poem, I want to read you one of the poems that Peter's written with his permission, because I think it speaks to some of what David is speaking about, but also to what I'm seeing between this tension between, wanting to rethink development, wanting to imagine development differently, and all these amazing conversations that everyone is having about localization, all these, really important things. And the very contemporary reality that people are experiencing, right, where the development infrastructure, the humanitarian infrastructure is very slow to kind of actually change and respond to this. So this is from a booklet that we published in September. And so this is the final poem that Peter contributed to this. So I'm just going to read the first kind of half of the poem. So after the protests, a notice arrives. They said no to the categories, their voices cracked in the dust, their placards raised like empty bowls to the sky that has no ears. Bullets answered, blood spilled into the red Kakuma soil. Mothers buried sons, fathers lowered daughters, and some, too tired to wait, tied ropes of despair to the trees. Now, as if nothing ever happened, a paper arrives. Bamba is back. It shouts in blue and red, like a festival, like a gift, like grief has an expiry date. Category 1, 55%. Category 2, 35%. Category 3, 20%. If you live through verification, if your finger still presses against their machine. But where was this order when people starved in silence? Where was this urgency before the suicides, before the gunfire? Why must the dead always be the price for ration cards and surveys? They tell us, come line up again. Bring your fingers, bring your patience, bring your grief and pretend it never happened. But no paper can erase the wounds. No chart can measure hunger's betrayal. So it's it's really hard to just move on from that. Every time I read Peter's poem, this is the reaction I feel and experience, because and seeing how his poetry spread across social media with people who were no longer in the camps, with people who had, gone back to South Sudan or left, really just shows like the resonance of listening to these voices in ways that, an academic paper, as far as I can see, will never sort of achieve or capture. And so to me, the idea that you maybe naively that you wouldn't take this sort of voice or expression seriously just really seems so bizarre. So these are just some of the kind of brief reflections that have emerged out of my conversations with Peter, and also with Victor, who is the incredibly talented political cartoonist that we worked with. Also, you can see his work just here in the visuals. That without accounting for the histories and the marginalized voices, we cannot understand these spaces and experiences. And these are things that, a household level survey or something like that is, so routinely done in spaces like refugee camps, will never be able to capture. There is an inherent value, I think, in working with mediums of communication that are locally meaningful. We haven't figured out whether we take this forward into a formal journal space or anything like that yet, but having this is in some sort of academic platform or scholarly platform or university space, published through LSE, has been really meaningful for kind of getting attention to some of these voices, right? NGOs in Kenya and things and international institutions have been much quicker to sit up and listen, just because there's that stamp of approval, in the form of the publisher. And the other thing I wanted to highlight, because I think, there's this tendency to see these things as isolated or trivial or, very sort of locally contextualized, is that, Peter's voice has incredible resonance across scales and across geographies. And I think that's true of so much of the kind of arts engagement that we see elsewhere, is it actually has more resonance than, the breakdown of the numbers of things like that we might otherwise take seriously. And the way that these outpourings move across geographies tells us something about the shared experiences of wider institutions, and also carries a responsiveness to emerging situations in an uncertain world, which I think, obviously resonates with a lot of the themes that we've been discussing today. So the publication is also, I don't know if there's a way to show these slides, but the publication details are kind of listed at the top there. So please do go and have a look at the work. And yeah, Peter and Victor are both incredible artists that, yeah, their work deserves attention. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to hand over to Nita now.
Is that mine? No. Which is mine? Hi, everyone. I am Nita Mishra. And I just wanted to start with saying that I don't think this is the title I gave, but it kind of suits it. And it emerges from a paper I wrote exactly a year back, which David read somehow within 3 days of it being published. And then he emailed me saying, my God, I can't believe that, you think alike. Can we take Well, we started talking about this, and here we are a year later, kind of hoping to launch, quote unquote, this whole concept of development humanities. Because in the story of development, we do need different sources of what we call data or narratives, and that's where we are coming from, and that's how we are here today. And I'm very grateful to Susan for providing us this platform today. So unusual sources of qualitative data and poetry. Just to say that I write poetry also. But why it also resonates with me is that as a child, when I studied in India, there was a poem which haunts me even today, which is Suryakant Tripathi Nirala's Vah Todti Patthar. So वह तोड़ती पत्थर देखा उसे मैंने इलाहाबाद के पथ पर वह तोड़ती पत्थर. I'm deliberately not trying to do word-to-word translation. I want you to hear these words and to feel that, it's different, but it's saying the same thing. What is it saying? It's actually talking about this woman here. She's breaking stones. So we're talking about a woman who's breaking stones in the summer heat of Allahabad, which is a very hot city in the summers. And you can see, we're talking about, if you look at these pictures, which I got from the internet, we're talking about gender, women's rights. We're talking about labor rights. We are talking about poverty, hunger, all the SDGs we are talking about, most of them. We are also, talking about caste, class in the Indian context. And this kind of shows you. So the poem, if you can get a translation, is an amazing poem, which I won't read because I've got many slides, which I'm hopefully not going to cover. But then there are others, like you've heard of Amitav Ghosh's books, and he's actually talking about climate injustices and its impact on indigenous communities, for example. And he's also written, smaller commentaries or essays on the same. That makes more of an impact for a wider readership, those who can read in this case. So that was one thing. And, David did talk about other authors and Rohinton Mystery's A Fine Balance for me was the great Indian novel, which did not get the prize. I think Salman Rushdie got it that year. So then more recently, apart from David's article, everything falls out from, I think we have Andy Sumner and Laura Campbell's article where they talk about reimagining the methodological horizon. What can social science fiction offer development studies? So there is a conversation which has begun last year, which has its antecedents with Lewis, Rogers, and Woolcock papers, which I have a slide which has all of them together, which was in 2008. I think you first wrote on that. But what Laura and Andy are writing about, three objectives. They say, first, to trace social science fiction's intellectual genealogy and defining characteristics. Second, to outline how SSF methodological tools could be applied in development studies. Third, to illustrate how social science fiction use across how can it be used across the social sciences. We saw how Charlotte also tried to do that. They argue that SSF could enable scholars to develop new conceptual and theoretical ideas about past, present, and possible future social orders. So it kind of links to our title of the conference also. And when applied systematically, SSF offers rigorous tools for conceptual innovation in analyzing emergent, complex, or under-theorized phenomena. So under-theorized phenomena is the important thing, such as the dynamics of global inequalities in development studies. So these were the antecedents, which I would say, so I'm very honored to have David Lewis quoting my work in his paper, but this story had started already, and we never gave it enough, we did not have the opportunity to talk about it in detail. I actually heard Uma Kothari in September talking about film, how art can be used to understand or analyze the development narrative of colonialism. And actually that paper is in your 2014 book also. So that was quite interesting that people were talking about it, and now more openly without being worried about, it doesn't sound, development economics-y and to that effect. Also at the Nordiv, that's a Norway Development Conference where I heard Uma Kothari give one of the keynotes. There was this film by Vivian Price, which made more of an impact than any of the papers probably did, because it was showing my people affected by mining, their stories, and how their daily livelihood was impacted, and the displacement story. We've read a lot of paper, and World Bank has produced a lot of papers on displacement. In fact, I did work in the 90s on a few of those. So art in its various forms as a creative method, but also as data, is an approach the European Association of Development Research Institutes, research and training institutes of, Alfredo is also vice president, a co-vice president with me, has been doing it through its task group on decolonizing knowledge for development, which is, again, an important aspect of this whole story of development humanities, because we are bringing in different voices hitherto, unheard of, or we did not listen to those voices. So if you look at, there is a huge collection of rich, narratives from across the globe. You can have a look at the EADI website on this. These blogs, such as Weaving Our Stories, Identities as We Go By, or Storytelling, a Method to Support Decolonizing Development, are some of the examples, to add to Charlotte's, story also. It would be, so the story has kind of begun. Then in all of this, coming back to, David Lewis found me and emailed me, and that's how the story, and I'm very proud to see, if you read that paper, you'll see my name there, and my paper on poetry, the emancipatory potential of poetry is there in decolonizing development. So it's great to see that we are back in the story, and we were doing this quite on a parallel basis. We did not know each other. So now, to situate myself, to go back a little further, when I was doing my PhD, I did want to write a ballad. I just did not know why, but I was in the wrong school, wrong department. My PhD supervisor, thankfully is not here, said, I can't do a ballad, you can't do a ballad. But yet here I am, and thanks to Professor Lewis. But before I do that, I want to remind us what development has meant for, so long. Just to go back, the 1969 declaration, said development shall be founded on respect for dignity and value of human person, and shall ensure the promotion of human rights and social justice. And then link it to the photograph, the poem that I read out, not the full poem, Torti Patthar. So, or the ICJ wrote in 1981, that basic needs can be fulfilled only if structural changes at all levels enable people. Now, to identify own needs, mobilize their own resources, and shape their own future in their own terms. So think about these things, and think about the people who cannot do those things. And then Article 1986, the 1986 Right to Development speaks about the right to development is an inalienable human right by virtue of which every person and all peoples are entitled. So it's a right, it's a claim to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy, economic, social, cultural, political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be realized. This, like Sen Gupta says, development, and quoting Sen, of course, because development means expansion of freedoms and rights that improve the well-being of all people. Now, think about all of this. Think about what Charlotte was talking about in the poem. So human capabilities, freedoms, and entitlements are central concerns of the development narrative, right? Due recognition was given to it in the 1990 HDR. Life expectancy, literacy. So literacy is important, but how many of the world's population that we are targeting through development projects are literate? How many of them know the colonial languages of English or Spanish or French or Dutch? They don't. How do you reach them? You reach them through stories like, Charlotte was talking about. And literacy is not universal. Who is literate? And what about those who are not literate and yet have other ways to communicate, express their concerns, opinions, discriminations, poverty, health, other inequalities? So this is where humanities has a role in development studies. So because every research methodology, so poetry not just as data or as a research method, but also in different ways, which we do not yet know, probably people use that. It's a way of seeing the world. And every way of seeing is a way of not seeing. We are seeing certain things, we are not seeing other things. And that's why we can see certain things. So arts-based inquiry. So I do make a pitch for arts-based inquiry in development studies or in the department that I teach, politics and public administration. So poetry is just one such method. What I will try and do, if I have the time, illustrate, how poetry, two poetry workshops I have been involved in Ireland, facilitated women of marginal sections to come out, and both were, one was funded by DSAI and one was by EADI. So the DSAI, EADI summer school on research methods happened a couple of years back in Tipperary. And that's where we had a few poets. I wanted to read her poem, bring her poem, but I did not, I think, because of the time constraint. Helen Hutchinson is an Irish traveler poet. She belongs to one of the first traveler families to be housed under the Itinerancy Act of 1967. And assimilation cost her family a lot. So she went through, we all understand how how travelers have been treated for so long and how they are on the margins of Irish society even today. And how do they tell their story? Because when they go to school, they're not, that respect is not there. Cindy Joyce is my colleague in UL, and if you hear her, it's, so there's a lot of discrimination there. But Helen Hutchinson was writing poetry. Now it's well published. They are published, we are talking about it, and we kind of bring in those stories. We know better about travelers' lives through those poems and through those informal workshops, informal settings, which I have been involved in for a while now. And with that are migrant stories like Gonji Kanbamba, who's from Mongolia, and people like me who started off in these small informal settings of using migrant poetry. And here I am today after 18 years. So, and then the next one was a year and a half back, we did a Traveler Roma and Nomadic Poets workshop in the Museum of Literature in Dublin, and where we had a great conversation, a full day workshop. Let's just write what we want to write. And that's what we did. I was a facilitator, one of the facilitators here. But what the learnings from the two workshops were quite common. A deep sense of injustice and disrespect to self may lead to different forms of resistance. And this is what was happening in that group. There's this whole thing that how do you express your disrespect, which society has given to Roma, nomadic, traveler women. Poetry helped create a more reflexive research process and a feminist ethical process. Others have spoken about that, and such a journey into the self is no less treacherous than crossing the borders and boundaries inhabited by the exotic other. So, and this was powerful for the facilitators as well. So there were two white Irish women facilitators, well-educated, who wrote eventually that, I feel deeply uncomfortable about facilitating this workshop. For me, I think it was impossible to create a space with settled people in the room that made it possible for them to be comfortable. So people, the two facilitators were questioning themselves, which was outstanding. I've never been in a room where we teach development studies, we teach about race, ethnicity, we talk about critical theory, but we say it without really interrogating ourselves. So they're rightfully wary of going deep because of her presence, is what one of them said. Another uncomfortable facet is the sense that they do not have the resources. So that's where development studies can fit in. Poetry as a sense-making tool, and we've kind of heard of that, so I'm going to run through this. And social justice, again, if you think of that photograph and linking it to the SDGs, those pictures of Torti Pathar, and you can see we are actually talking about social justice issues in the administration of the public, for example. Or if you want to link it to the pedagogy of the oppressed, which is, Irish development education sector, Frere is God to the Irish development sector. So You reinforce Freire's argument, voice alone is not sufficient to achieve liberation, and that the goal is for voice to inspire action to create change. And that's what we are trying to do here. So critical poetic inquiry has a role here. It also protests again against Eurocentrism, which is why I was trying to read the Hindi poem. It challenges knowledge power dynamics between the researcher and the researched, which we see in the second workshop also. So value added, I have some, I have loads of value added points here. But, it's about resistance, it's about research poem as data, but it's also about equally returning data to the community context. It's what Charlotte was saying, that people come do extractive, research and go back without. I'm done. Okay, so I am going to stop here because I told I have some 50 slides. I don't want to go through them. And thanks, Susan, for stopping me here. But there's loads more, and it's in the paper also. Thanks. Well,